name is Michael. I am a student. I like demography.
Excellent. Apologies for not recognized repeat offenders here. Okay, so great, and I will take it away with Dan.
Great. Yes, we like the multi-stage introduction, and so now thank you, Josh. So I am delighted to introduce Sarah Reynolds. Sarah received her PhD in economics at Cornell, and she subsequently completed a postdoc with Jer Berman and Leah Fernald and served as a lecturer here at Berkeley. She is now a research associate funded by a prestigious and very hard to get K99 award at the School of Public Health. She's also a friend of demography, a frequent attendee at the Brownbag, and an affiliate of the Berkeley Population Center. Her research examines how family dynamics and social policies influence children's and women's outcomes in Latin America. One of Sarah's innovations, as I see it, maybe you, is to look beyond the nuclear family and to take a multi-generational perspective on how families shape well-being. And in so doing, she calls us to revise simpler models of family structure effects and of often dyadic models of conflict or unitary preferences with household dynamics. Sarah's work has been published widely, including in demographic research, social science and medicine, and the review of economics in the household, and has been funded by NIH. Please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Thanks for having me here today. I'll be speaking on the role of fathers and grandparents in raising children in Peru. But first I'm going to continue the introduction. I'm going to introduce my talk by telling you how I got to this research question, which is part of a larger study on Latin America looking at this same topic within a variety of countries. So my interest in Latin America goes all the way back to undergraduate when I double majored in economics and Spanish. I like these subjects both so much that I couldn't decide, initially at least, where to go to graduate school, in which subject. So I decided not to go to graduate school. Instead, I got a Fulbright to Columbia, where I got to take economics classes in Spanish, getting the best of both worlds, and a love of Latin America. So once I did finally go to do my PhD in economics, I always wanted to return to Latin America to do field work. But within economics, I had to find something as exciting and stimulating as these Spanish novels I had studied. So I came across the subject of inter-household allocation, became interested in how husbands and wives make decisions in the family regarding children's welfare. But when I went to Brazil to do some pilot field work, I discovered that many of the families looked like this. And there wasn't a father there. There was a lot of teenage mothers who lived with their mothers. So I changed my topic to study this type of family dynamic for my dissertation. Then, several years later, I started working with Leah Fernald here in the School of Public Health. And she had a data set on Chile and child development in Chile. She hired me to research preschools in Chile and how that affected child development, but I still managed to sneak in a few demographic control variables. So I added to the study if fathers were in the households and if grandparents were in the households. And looking at that closer, it was really interesting that in about half the households in Chile, of these young children, they looked like this. There was the young child, the mother, and the grandmother, and the father was not present. And the other half were nuclear families. So while I did get that preschool paper more or less finished, I also wrote another paper on household structure and transitions in Chile. And that became the foundation for the K99 grant that I have that Leora helped so much with, and the demography department also provided a seed grant for. I found data from 5 countries in Latin America that has outcomes on child development, including cognitive scores, and information about the child's household structure. So in all of these data, from the preliminary look, about 30% of these young children live in intergenerational households. So that's quite high and quite interesting. So I did the research on Chile, and now I've moved on to Peru, And in the future, we'll have Colombia, Mexico, and Uruguay. But first, Peru. So the scenario in Peru. This is children age 0 and 1 living in different types of household structures. This was from 2001, the data I'm using. So you can see that about 1/3 of the children are co-residing with grandparents. And we have a large portion of nuclear families. Not as many fathers absent from the home, about 15%, but it's still a significant number. So I'll be using these colors throughout my talk, so you keep that in mind. But these are the nuclear families, the light blue, the reddish pink is only the single mother. This is yellow for mother plus grandparent, and then the dark blue is for the most people in the household. So what I saw in Chile and Brazil is that these families with the grandparents existed where the mother was younger. So just to check that scenario within Peru as well, you can see the mother's age and the probability or the likelihood, prevalence of living in these different family types by mother's age. So this top one's the nuclear family, and here we have 2-parent plus grandparent and the single mother plus grandparent. So there's like this bump that happens here in the mid-20s where there's sort of a shift from more grandparent families for the younger women and then a shift over into more nuclear type families. So my research questions for this population is, are the grandparents and fathers important for child development? Since we see these interesting and different family structures. So I'll be looking at the nutrition and cognitive outcomes, and then I'll hopefully be able to explore a little bit about why. So what I find is that when I look cross-sectionally, there is a correlation between grandparents and the child outcomes. Children do better in households where there are grandparents, and that this is totally explained by SES or wealth. When I look longitudinally using child fixed effects, the wealth, there doesn't seem to be any change in wealth when household structure changes, which is quite curious. But there does seem to be an impact on cognition, although not on nutrition. Particularly in the areas where grandparents have lower educational attainment.
The fixed effects are for different children aged 1 to the same mother, is that the idea?
Oh, no, I'll show you shortly. It's longitudinal, so it's the same child.
Same child.
Mm-hmm. So, why do we expect that different family members would be influencing child development differently? We can think about how child development happens as a function of income and time. And we might, there's a lot of literature that shows that fathers have more income, and so when fathers are in the households with fathers have more income and better SES measures. On the other hand, for grandparents, maybe it could go either way. They're older, so maybe they have more productivity, more income. On the other hand, depending on the context, if it's more of a labor-based economy, the grandparents might be more of using up more income than they are providing within the household. And for time, fathers are pretty notorious for not spending as much quality time with children as perhaps mothers and grandmothers. So that's a possibility that these grandparents are additional caregivers within the household. So,
how do you think about the indirect effect of the father earning money and giving the mother more time?
yes, that's definitely a possibility.
Or the grandparents, same way?
Yes. Yes. So that would be like who's taking care of the child in a sense? So if you could also buy out your preschool, your care through preschool as well. So I haven't put that in this study. But it does, you can look at who is the primary caregiver and kind of see if that changes based on household composition. Yes?
And is mostly caregiving for young children at least done informally by family members, by co-residential family members, by others, or is there center-based and paid care, or is there even government-provided childcare?
Yeah, in Peru, that's a great question. I think there are some center-based cares, but for really young children, it's probably more informal. I have to check, and I will be going to Peru in a couple weeks, so I can get the real story from them as well. I'll present this paper so they can fill me in. But yes, that's a good question to see if who's taking care of the child changes based on the family structure and the availability of such centers. But they definitely do have some government-coordinated local mother leadership childcare options.
Could you clarify, you're only looking at 1-year-old children?
No, I'll be coming up to that soon. But yeah, it's
And do
it's
you
gonna
have
be
actual
following them.
longitudinal
Yes.
data?
So many of these inputs we can't necessarily measure exactly how they flow from the father and the grandparent, inputting it into the child and how that turns into wonderful child development outcomes. But there's a lot of studies that measure the outcomes based on who's in the household, particularly on fathers. So Danny actually was a co-author on one of these review papers to examine how fathers are important for child development, and let me know if I get this right. They seem to be most important for socio-emotional outcomes, and particularly for boys. And they also, having fathers in the household, improves educational attainment, but not as strongly actual test scores and intelligence scores. Okay. There is less literature on grandparents. For the developing world, some studies have used grandparents in the household as control variables, and have found that this results in improved health outcomes for the children. There's also a few studies which have taken advantages of pension schemes. So in South Africa, Esther Duflo looks at the implementation of a pension and examines child welfare for co-residing grandchildren, and finds that health outcomes improve when grandparents are co-residents. And then Ponzek does the same thing in Brazil and finds improved literacy for the co-residing grandchildren. And then my study on Chile found that when children are transitioning out of grandparents' household, the children who have left don't do as well on vocabulary scores as the same children, or as children who have stayed, controlling for their previous scores. So this paper on Peru contributes to the literature on family structure in this context in the developing world, which is not very well represented within this literature. And it allows for, as Danny said in the introduction, looking at more family types beyond just nuclear and if the father is in or out of the household. And then this data from Peru, it has an advantage on Chile in that it follows children for more years. Chile, I just had 2 years. But as you'll see, the data from Peru surveys the children at age 1, age 5, age 8, and age 12. So I showed you the family structure at age 1. This is data from Young Legs, Peru. This is from Oxford. It's a really great data set. It has very comprehensive data on the child's experience as growing up. Very thorough, and they have pretty good follow-up as well. They have outcomes for the children on nutritional measures, as well as they give them a vocabulary test and a math test, so they have cognitive outcomes as well. And then they have a bit of sibling data available. It's not quite nationally representative. They exclude the wealthiest 5% of the municipalities from their sampling. And while they did random sample, they did 10 random samples and then chose the random sample that best fit with their goals of making it diverse to cover the Peruvian population and also accessible logistically for the data collection process.
Is there much loss over time?
I'll show you that shortly. There's not much, no, only about 10%. And then the family structure, compared to Chile, there weren't that many like other adults in the household, but compared to Chile, there's, as you'll see shortly too, that it's more complex. So here's the sample sizes for the different outcomes I'll be using. So you can see it's pretty good. The children we have data for all rounds of the survey. And then, so they only start doing vocabulary and height when the children are 5 years old. And then they collected data on the next younger sibling in rounds 3 and 4 when the children were 8 and 12. But for vocabulary, once again, they only collected data if the younger sibling was age 5 or older. So I won't use all the data on the younger siblings, but I wanted to put up there to show how great this survey is in case you want to use it. Also, they have the same study in Vietnam and Ethiopia and India. So like, if any of these countries interest you, you want to repeat this. Great data from Young Labs. So now I'll show you about the outcome measures. So this is BMI. So I standardized the outcome measures by age because I will be looking at the changes over time. So standardizing by age allows us to make those comparisons easily. Fortunately, the World Health Organization has our standardizations for the anthropometrics. So for BMI, you can see the average is pretty consistent, so we don't have much concern about needing to adjust this anymore for age. And then you can also see these are the focus children of the survey, and then the scatter points in between are the younger siblings, data from the younger siblings at the different ages.
And 0 is the average?
No, 0,
Of the
so
world?
this is, yeah, I guess for the world, of the healthy children in the world is the standard.
And are there older siblings, or
No.
these are all firstborn? Or?
There are older siblings, but they only take measurements on the next younger sibling.
How is it then that you get some dots to the right of age?
Oh, so I think these ones are like a couple of children that were more difficult to find, so they just ended up being older when they surveyed them later in time.
So I'm just trying to get my head around the standardization procedure. So is it standardized within the sample, or is it standardized?
This is standardized by the World Health Organization, so an external standardization.
So it would be possible for everybody to be above 0?
Yes, it could be. And then height for age is the same thing, standardized by the World Health Organization standards. Although I do have to make an adjustment, because you can see here in age 1, the height for age is dropping as the children get older. This is quite common in developing countries where their children's nutritional status when they're first born is pretty good because they've taken it all from the womb. But as they get older, they lose out on some nutrition and maybe have more diseases. So as they get older, it kind of falls off. So I just take their predicted, based on this linear section, take their predicted score, and then this flattens out. Yes?
Think about the BMI thing for a moment, and with this, were people more concerned about obesity or about stunting?
So there's not that much stunting. There's some in Peru, but not so much. The obesity, also there's not a lot of thinness, so we're more concerned about, it's more or less gone through that transition, and obesity is more of a concern than stunting. Although you can see there's still quite a few lower children. then here, I think this little bump, my theory is that this little bump is from school, and that they're going to school and getting a little more nutrition, so I control for schooling. And then over here, I think this is the same thing with these children being very hard to find, and they're more rural and more likely to be less nourished. So for vocabulary, I do have to do the standardization within the sample because there is not an external norm for how children should be learning vocabulary. So I just take a polynomial of the mean predicted polynomial and use that as the age-specific mean and the standard deviation, taking into account this floor effect here at the youngest ages with a Tobit. And the math, as you recall, the younger children didn't have any math scores, so we have these gaps with no information. So for these, I standardize separately each round linearly. Okay, so, oh yeah, sorry.
For the vocabulary and math scores, is that just how well they did on the exam?
Yes, these are like their points on the test. And you notice that the math score test was different in the second round, and the third and fourth rounds, it was the same test. So it's a little bit
Age in years.
different.
Is that age in years or age in months?
Oh, sorry, age in years. Yeah, that should be age in years. Yes.
Could you just, why are you doing the standardization?
I'm doing the standardization so that we can compare children's outcomes over time without being concerned about what the points mean. So how do I define family structure? As I said, it was a little bit complicated here. So starting off with grandparents. What can a grandparent mean? It could mean any of these things. So this is the prevalence of different grandparent types at age 1 year. These paternal grandparents, it's a little bit uncertain because they didn't, at age 1 year, they didn't even ask the difference between maternal and paternal, just grandmother and grandfather. However, if the grandparent was still living in the household at age 5, I use that identity to pull back to age 1. And if not, I just assumed it was maternal. But you can see it's still very low. So I tested if there seemed to be any differences by grandparent type and didn't find any. So what I'll be using is this any grandparent category, and you can just keep in mind that the grandparent most likely to be in the household for any grandparent is the maternal grandmother.
Did you look at gender differences, in other words, between grandmother versus grandfather?
I probably did, but I'll have to double check. It's been a long
I
time.
didn't find any.
No. So, as we looked at the beginning, I told you about these 4 family types, but the structure is a little bit more complex, and I have these 3 other family types that I end up controlling for, but I didn't want to lump them into the main family types that I'm looking at. So here we have stepfathers, and then these rows tell you what portion of people are in these households. So in the stepfather category, there's always a biological mother, and there's always a stepfather, and then 13% of the families also happen to have a grandparent. But because it's a stepfather and not a biological father, I didn't want to put that into the other category. And then we have the other extended. So this is like a nuclear family in that there's both biological mother and biological father, but there's other adults in the household that might confound. If I was lumping them in with nuclear family, that might be different. And then finally, there's the no mother family. So for a small portion of observations, there's not a mother. So of course, this also would not really fit into these categories. So you can see these are the highest in the data. These are not as high, but they're still present. So I just include them as like controls, but don't necessarily expect to find anything in these using these categories. So I do 3 types of comparisons. I have first cross-sectional comparisons, and then within child comparisons using child fixed effects. So that allows us to look at the children at different time points and different family structures, comparing the same child's outcomes under the different family structures. And then finally, I look at sibling fixed effects. Because you can have that first child at the earliest time point in one family structure, child gets older, family structure changes, and then the sibling gets born, and we have that outcome. Yes?
So with the fixed effects, with child fixed effects models, how do we think about these transitions? Are you going to be estimating transition-specific effects, going from single mother to mother-grandparent, or are you just estimating the effect of a transition?
I'm estimating the effect of living in a certain family structure type.
So you're picking up the estimate off of a change between the types,
yes, right? Yes, because there are different time periods and different family structures. But I'm not, because there's 4 time points, I'm not measuring if the structure here was one type and the structure here was a different type. I'm not like looking at the direction of the change. It's just whether they are in it or not.
Okay. I'm not sure. Okay, well, we'll see it. Yeah.
Okay, yes, and I have many graphs of transitions. So. Okay, so first the cross-sectional results. Everything's in comparison to the nuclear family. So compared to the nuclear family, at age 1, these outcomes are much better, or well, they're better for families with a grandparent. So this really surprised me. Often in demographic theory, we think that as cultures get wealthier, that enables families to live apart and not be as so intergenerationally co-residing. But here we see that these families, they're doing better in the child outcomes. And that still holds, this is family structure at age 1 year, and the results still holds with the outcomes. So is that possibly explained by wealth? So here is the family structure by wealth quintile. This really surprised me. The highest wealth quintile, we have the largest portion of intergenerational cohabitation for these young children. Similarly for mother's education level, so these dots represent the portion of mothers at these different educations. So there's not very many mothers with tertiary, but still there's the largest portion of intergenerational co-residence. Examining the covariates, here's the wealth indexes provided by the survey. And these, once more, these wealth indices are higher when the grandparent is in the household, which probably explains the child doing better. Similarly, mothers are more schooled, and not surprisingly, the firstborn children are more likely to live with grandparents than later born children. So when I put the outcomes, when I do a regression just on family structure, we see that children with grandparents do better, but when I include all of these control variables, all those differences are completely explained, particularly when I just include the wealth and parent control variables, those differences go away completely. Yes?
So if you have a model that's got family structure effects and then all of the demographic controls, but not the SES, not the sort of endogenous SES controls, you still see significant family structure differences, and then you introduce the SES variables and you attenuate?
If I include the child variables and the geographical variables, the differences are still there, but not once these.
So is it the parent, is it mother's years of schooling and mother indigenous that's doing the work, or is it the SES variables?
I think it's the SES variables. I mean, these are all correlated anyway.
Okay.
Yes.
What might be the role of migration, internal migration?
Oh, so that's a great question for me to ask in Peru.
What I mean is there might be a preference for extended families and families being able to stay together, but that some people might need to leave for labor migration or something.
Yeah.
Children, or like the children, I don't really know the situation for that.
Yeah, and I think that might be the case of the no mother families, so I need to look into that where the mother's not there. Yes?
What is the housing quality index? Because it strikes me one reason why you may have more grandparents in better off families is they have bigger houses.
Yes, that's possible.
But, What
I'd have
is the
to check.
quality index measure?
I'd have to check. It probably includes like what the floor is made of and what the roof is made of, those type of things. But I have to check.
But so is the interpretation is that the rich families can afford to live intergenerationally?
That's possible. That's yes. So I divide this up a little farther to look at the education levels. So here is I'm comparing these columns to nuclear families where the father has secondary education. And then this is nuclear families where father has less than secondary education. And then we have the grandparent families, and these I've divided by grandparent less than secondary and grandparent has secondary. So it's quite interesting that comparing dad's secondary to grandparent secondary, the grandparents, the children with grandparents, they're still doing better on these outcomes.
But this is not controlling for socioeconomic.
No, it's not. It's not. And then where we do see a difference is, where was the difference? Oh, when the grandparent has less than secondary, the children are doing worse than the nuclear families with the father having secondary. So, I just wanted to show you the differences by urban and rural. It's very similar. There's a few more nuclear families in rural areas, but also this differences in education. Back here, there's no rural families with grandparents having secondary education, so that's kind of, limits what we can say about if these differences come from education or from location. Okay, now on to child fixed effects. So we're looking at the same child at different points in time and looking at the different household structure at the different points in time and seeing how that correlates. So for this estimation strategy to work, the children have to have different household structures over time. There has to be some kinds of transitions. So here are the different rounds, and lumped together you can see the portion in different families. So you can see that over time there's fewer and fewer grandparents. Nuclear families kind of stable and more single mothers. Yes?
Can you tell whether the adult kids have moved in with the grandparents or the grandparents have moved in with the adult kids?
So I control for if they're moving location, not of their house, but of their community. But I'm not, I guess I could check to see who's the household head. But based on the youthfulness of the mother, I'm expecting they're staying with their parents.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So this is, each line is an observation. So this block up here is all the children who have always been in nuclear families throughout the entire course of the survey. And then down here we have children starting off with grandparents, fewer, and etc. So you can see there's a lot of movement going on. And now close up, these are children only with transitions. So basically the same thing, but removing those who have not changed family structure. Here is different family structures and different rounds and transitions. So you can see that 43% of the children have not had a transition, so we get a lot of information from those remaining 57% of children. So almost 80% have at some point in time lived in a nuclear family, but we see a lot of grandparents coming and going. Yes?
So it looks like over time there are, or as children age, there are fewer and fewer with grandparents, correct? Is that because moving out or because the grandparents are dying?
Great question. The data's, I think it was missing in round 3 if there was people were deceased or not, so I didn't look at that, but I divided it by older grandparents and younger grandparents. didn't see a difference. And still, because these mothers are young, I still think it's more likely that they're moving out and not because the grandparents are dying. Okay, so examining wealth. So we saw that the grandparents were more wealthy than the two-parent families in the cross-sectional case. So we'd imagine that when the grandparents or the children exit the household from the grandparents, probably their wealth would go down. That's what I was thinking. However, this shows no such relationship in the longitudinal analysis, which suggests that somehow grandparents are families that are like protecting their children and grandchildren and not letting them move off until they can maintain a similar level of living standard. That's my thought. So, moving on to...
These are wealth, though, not income.
Yes, this is an index, a wealth
It's
index.
also consistent with the grandparents dying and leaving the wealth behind.
It could be, but
It's like an index of like assets, like motorcycle, radio, that kind of thing.
it's
Like
those
typical-
three parts, the housing index, the asset index, and like, I can't remember the other one. But yes, it's just like all this living standards type questions. So now for the nutrition outcomes. Again, we don't see very much going on here. So because we didn't see a change in wealth, that also doesn't necessarily surprise me. When I divided up the nutrition outcomes by the different levels of education, that didn't reveal too much either, although in rural areas,
Can you look at change? I mean, this is like stocks of health. And if you change family situation, it presumably is going to change the flow, maybe, but it won't, that'll have a very gradual effect on the
Yes.
stock. Could you look at
Yes.
changes in these, or the data won't really allow that?
You could. The thing is, there's four rounds, so you have to like do the change between the 3 different rounds. So I think that's possible. But the family fixed or the child fixed effects kind of takes out the average anyway.
So it is, okay.
So yeah.
So after, I see. So this is kind of a difference anyway, okay.
But I think it's still an interesting idea, because
Yes.
it's as if you had, well, you picking up the changes allows for them not being just fixed over time, but actually the family circumstance changing. I think it's a rich possibility to look at.
So only in rural areas, the single mothers, this was negative for children of single mothers and significant, negative 0.22. Okay. Now for cognitive outcomes, this is where we do see an effect. It's marginally significant. So we didn't see any, so we know this probably doesn't have anything to do with wealth, so there's probably something else going on, like grandparents interacting with the children or fathers not being present, influencing these math outcomes in particular, and perhaps a little bit here in vocabulary.
So these are to the worse. Yes, this
Yes.
is negative.
Well,
Okay.
it's negative in comparison to the nuclear family.
Uh-huh.
So here, yeah, this is where the nuclear family is better off. Yes?
So these fixed effects are kind of capturing the effects of these like transitions. So we're looking at here, it's kind of saying comparison between 2 different types of family, but how can we separate the effects of the family from the effects of the family transitions themselves, which I think Jamie's article kind of shows that there's like these transitions themselves have effects, right?
Yes, well, as you saw, the transitions were really complicated, so I haven't quite delved into that. I looked at cases where in like the round 1 the father was present, and then looking at the exit of the father or the entrance of the father was not present. Similarly with grandparents, if grandparents present and then the grandparent exits, what's that effect? And that didn't provide much richness, I thought, so I did it, but I don't remember it, so it probably wasn't that interesting. So.
I mean, I do think, if there's an analog to the US work and the Proud Families group that looks a lot at this, it is an indicator of just the count of the number of transitions
Yeah.
related.
Yeah,
And they're sort of agnostic with respect to what exactly is happening. In some ways, dad moving out is a transition, but so is a new social father moving in, and so is a grandma moving in, and the in and out both get counted, and they accumulate the number of exposures. And we see this in other literature too, on family instability.
Right. Right.
Seems like that could be a model worth running, where you have all this richness, but you could
Yeah,
lose it and just count.
I'm confused about how to interpret this with regards to the comparison and the fixed effects.
Yes.
So someone who bounced between single mother, the red and the yellow,
Yes.
that's their trajectory. They're still going to get estimates
In comparison
compared to the
nuclear
nuclear family?
Right, so you have to do a secondary difference. Or,
So can I,
But even if they never lived in a nuclear family, they'll get an
well,
estimate? That's what I,
yeah.
can I think rephrase maybe the same, which is how do we interpret like the coefficient here on single
Sure.
mother? Like what, yeah,
Sure.
sorry, yeah.
So it is in comparison to the nuclear family, so this would be like children who are at one point in time in nuclear families,
Okay.
then at a different point in time in a single mother family. When they're in that single mother family, their the vocabulary score is 0.02 higher than when they were in the nuclear family.
Got it. Okay.
Standardized.
Okay.
Yes. So we see that, interestingly, when the father is in the household, the grandparent doesn't seem to have an impact. But when the father is not in the household, then particularly in math, the grandparent seems to, the child doesn't do as well as when they're in the nuclear scenario.
Or the single mother scenario for vocab, right? I mean,
Yeah, right.
That test
Yeah,
is
it's
not
very
that
interesting.
comparison.
Yeah,
I can't
and
imagine.
these are like worse, a little, I mean, not statistically significantly worse, but these are larger magnitude than with
And
the
on the
single
left, they
mother.
may actually be significantly worse. I don't know.
Mhm. So the grandparent present, even with the single mother, in comparison to the single mother, might be worse. Okay,
These effects look small to me. Is that a correct interpretation?
well, I think this is, it's standardized, so it's like 0.2 standard deviations. I think it's not, it's what we might expect from preschool. Like if you put a child in preschool, they might increase their scores by 0.2 standard deviations.
Okay, thank you.
So just to show the same transitions, again, for the urban and rural, similar graphs, so you know it's not that much different in rural areas. And then, so I did some analyses again, dividing up the sample by different types of SES variables. So I'm only showing the ones that were interesting. So anything that's not up here didn't have much going on. So urban had like nothing. Dad primary didn't have anything, and then grandparent secondary also not things happening. But you can see that for rural, it looks like the grandparents are really having that impact on math. And similarly, when the father has secondary education, if the father's not in the household, then the children's score on math is worse. And then when the grandparent has primary education, when the grandparent is in the household, their score is worse. But not when the grandparent is secondary, and not when the father has primary. Yeah, so this is a bit smaller of a sample because we don't have as many families that have grandparents information. But this does seem to suggest that even though wealth isn't necessarily changing, the interactions that the fathers and grandparents have with children may somehow be influencing their cognitive scores. So my Chile paper had the vocabulary as an outcome, and that made a bit more sense to me than the math outcome because, you know, you can imagine grandparents as caretakers interacting with the children, speaking to them a lot. I'm not sure how grandparents are getting in the way of the math ability of the children, so hopefully when I go to Peru they can tell me what's going on. That's what I'm thinking. Okay. The other thing I did was to divide it into boys and girls, and this was quite curious to me as well. that the cognitive impacts of father absence seem to be focused here on girls and much lower, well, somewhat lower results for boys there. So I did a quick look at the gender preference with household structure, and we do see a very small, statistically significant difference of if fathers are in households where there's a girl or a boy, but that only comes out at age 12. And then they had a question about, for the absent fathers, the frequency of visits. This is a very unrefined question. It's like, how often do they visit? Never. Once a week. A couple times a month. So there's not much precision, and there was no statistically significant difference by sex for that. So this could be explored further to see how the gender biases exist or not in Peru. So I look at family fixed effects. Let me jump through this quickly. So the same question arises, is there enough variation in family structure between siblings? And you can see that there are a fair number of families where they do have variation. And once more, we have very little differences between siblings.
What's the variation comes from? Is this the difference between having a step and a biological father in the household, or is this...
It could be, or from living with or without a grandparent. You know, as the firstborns, we saw many of the firstborns are living with grandparents, and then laterborns are less likely to. So the younger sibling, the family might have already transitioned out.
Or at the, yeah.
Well, it's not exactly the same age because the younger sibling wasn't measured exactly at a particular age. It was just whenever they went. But yes, the first round that they were measured. So the earliest age we have the data recorded for. So not much happening here, looking at family fixed effects for siblings. But I did divide it by urban and rural, where I did find something of interest. But that's just for height for single mothers, and this is urban up here and rural down here. And then for vocabulary and math, just vocabulary, don't have math for siblings. Having a grandparent is worse in the rural areas. So remember, in the rural areas, there's no grandparents with secondary education. All right, so some conclusions. I saw that grandparents' co-residence is really high for young children in Peru, with about 1/3 of the children from 2001, age 1, living with their grandparents. And surprisingly, this is associated with better child outcomes, which we attribute to SES differences. Then for transitions, we also saw that these young children are experiencing many household transitions. However, there's no change in wealth when transitioning between family structure. We don't see any change in nutrition. However, there seems to still be some change in cognition, although because we can't attribute that to wealth because we didn't see a change in wealth. So grandparents with lower education may be hindering the cognition of these young children. Similarly, if fathers have higher education and they're not in the household, the children are not doing as well. And finally, we saw a couple of small instances suggesting that children of single mothers might have lower height. So these are the conclusions regarding these children who were born in 2001. I don't think I have time to tell you about the children who were born in 2015 or 14. I do? No, I don't. Okay, well, it's very similar. It's very similar. So, yeah, very similar. Same type picture. Very similar scenario. So what are the implications for policy? We might want to extend parenting programs to include grandparents as well as mothers and fathers, since there's so many intergenerational households, particularly in contexts where the grandparents have lower education levels. And then, as we saw that when fathers have secondary education, the children aren't doing as well. When their fathers are absent, we might want to try to improve their interaction with the child. Probably not just for fathers that have secondary education, but that's where we did see the largest difference. And then finally, more research on the transitions. What is prompting the exact timing of why the mothers are leaving the grandparents' household? Oh, sure. Yes.
Hi, Sarah. My name is Luisa, and I'm Brazilian. And I had some thoughts. In Brazil, most grandparents are likely to have some kind of government pension. So the household will probably will have some income secured. So that's why it's easier. It's easier for young mothers or couples that don't have income to live with their parents because they will have some money.
Yeah.
Even if it's not a lot, it's stable. Yeah, it's every month. Exactly.
That's a really great point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that plays some kind of role there. Probably in Peru, something like that also happens. And something else is that maybe there are differences between private and public schools, because private schools in Latin America, I guess, are not as fancy as they are here. You can have all kinds of private schools, and there are ones that are just not so bad as public schools, because public schools are always seen as bad. So maybe there's also a difference there. And about girls doing worse when they don't have a father present, I think it may be because of chores around the house. Again, girls are expected to participate in the household doing chores and doing all kinds of work from a very young age. So maybe that's why they're not having as much time to be studying. So these are
this is great. They didn't have like actual total income by category, but I could see if they have like a pension. They have like if they're receiving a conditional cash transfer for the children, but I could check to see if the pension question is also on the questionnaire. So that I'll look into the pension further. They do have time use for the children, and I did run those as outcome variables. So there wasn't much. I could double check to see if for girls there's a change in chores. But these are great suggestions. Thank you.
Do you have a time use survey for Peru?
Oh, I haven't looked to see if
or
there's
you mean
like
within this
within
survey?
Young Lives, yes.
Okay, because I know some of the countries, like Uruguay, Mexico, have time use surveys. Colombia and Costa Rica do it. I don't remember if they're in your thing, but of course they'll be for completely different years and everything. But it might be interesting to see how time use changes if there's a grandparent present and who's doing childcare and things like that, just to give ideas for interpreting all of this.
Right. They have the time use for the children on this survey, and it's just like how many hours a day do they do in these different activities, like going to school, playing, caring for other kids. Yes.
If you were advising the government of Peru, I'm wondering whether it wouldn't be better advice just to say invest heavily in education, because the socioeconomic effects sort of wiped out so many of the other effects, rather than expanding parenting programs or grandparents, et cetera, which is kind of getting at the margins. What do you think?
I think it's true. I think it's true that education is definitely important, but we still see that in the higher wealth context that the grandparents and the children are cohabitating. So there still might be room to like figure out how to incorporate them in family decision-making processes. So I'm working with a PhD student from the School of Education who's doing interviews in Chile, and she's interviewing grandparents who are co-residing with their grandchildren, and there's this tension that grandmothers are facing. How do they be a mother and discipline their child while still having the mother? be the primary decision maker. And they also want to take on their indulgent grandparent role and spoil the grandchild. So the grandmothers like haven't quite figured out how to reconcile these two roles. So I think there's still room to acknowledge that these types of families are out there and incorporate a model of parenting that includes them. Yes.
So, this may be the geographic equivalent of a temporal mismatch in the sense that it doesn't belong here. But when I saw the design, I thought, well, what we're picking up is at age 5, there's a grandparent in the household, and here's their test score or their But I'm thinking in the dynamic way, and of course the curveball that makes my question maybe even more maybe applicable is that it's the wealthy that seem to be, the well-off that seem to be bringing in the grandparents. But I'm thinking that, geez, I can't handle this, could you come in? And there's already problems. And so if at age 2 or 3, the person decides to move in with their parents or bring the grandparent in, we could be picking up an effect of that there was deficit already and it just hasn't been made up yet by the grandparent. Because there's a gap. We don't know when the grandparent moved in.
Yes, it's a limitation. But we only have that snapshot of those specific times, so we don't know how much time before the survey they were living together.
Right, but the thrust of my question was, do you have any information, or can you get any information on what leads people to bring the parent in? I mean, maybe the story I'm telling is, maybe there's a cultural reason that that's not how it would operate. That's how I would think it would operate
I think it's
in a lot of countries.
not
but
so
maybe
much
not in Peru.
that they bring the parent in, but that they never leave. It's just kind of inertia. They they get pregnant and then they, for whatever reason, cultures change that they don't go off and marry their boyfriend. Instead, they just stay in the household. So my question would be more like, why do they leave? What's the reason behind their transitioning out?
But just to push up a little further on this, the surprising result to me was that you were worse off living with your mom and your grandmother than you were just your mom.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
at the beginning you said
cases.
it could go either way. It could be that these parents contribute, or that they require, say, the attention of the mother. That's kind of a causal story for why having a grandmother around might not be a good thing. And then you have the selection story, which is when you're in trouble, you move in with your mom, which is also the pension story. Are you leaning one way or the other? Do you have any strategies to figure this out? Is your gut telling you, no, I don't think it's a selection story?
Well, I think in some ways it's a selection story since we saw that the wealth is pretty consistent over time, no matter what household structure they're in. And also, regarding, it's kind of like your question on childcare. Maybe when the grandparent's in the household, the single mother's not sending her child off to preschool, where perhaps those preschool teachers are slightly more educated than the grandparents, so that might be a part of it. So I could check further into if the child is a preschooler or not, although that only would be applicable at age 1. I'm not sure if they have that for the younger siblings.
I guess one thing might be you could do directionality, maybe your sample isn't that big enough, but to go between those two transitions in the single mom to living with your mother, there's probably going to be a lot of selection there. The other way, there might be also selection, but probably not because suddenly I won a lottery ticket and I can move out on my own. It's probably less a resource story than something else, I'm thinking.
Yeah, I could check. That's interesting. Yes.
Go ahead. That's fine.
When you were looking at within family effects, did you see, or did you observe if there was any difference if the child studied was the first child born, or if they were the younger sibling, or if they were a middle child?
So I did control for if it was the focus child, the older child, or not. I don't think I put in if the focus child was the firstborn or not.
Because the same difference, I'm thinking like the same difference you see between a younger child could be the same difference between
Right.
them and their older sibling.
Right, yeah, that's a good question. Like, is grandparents, are we just saying that the older children are doing better and they just happen to also be living with grandparents? I think I did divide it up between firstborns and laterborns at one point. But since I didn't present it, I guess there wasn't much going on. May.
So I have a que- I mean, so we talked about your, like, you know, the grandparents aren't grandparents or aren't parenting all the children, but I think when that happens, from personal experience, when there's grandparents in the household, a virgin of birth, it's actually tension.
Maternal grandparents.
It's actually, there's tension, right? And especially if it's different from expectations. I'm thinking of these young women, right? Like you decided, I don't know what, I think access to abortion is pretty low in Peru.
Yeah.
It's illegal, right? So it's like not that existent, right? I think it was a formal ways. So then you're like, well, I guess you didn't decide to keep the baby then. You have a baby. And then, you know, in terms of like, do you have anything about expectations of the mothers, anything about their relationships with these brands, to get a little bit more at the story, like what is happening with the, you know, grand plus mother families?
Well, motherhood is very celebrated in Latin America. So, like, in that way, some of these young mothers, the younger, poorer ones, this part of the story of adolescent motherhood, they might be having their children in order to gain some social status and esteem. So that could be part of what's going on. And then in Brazil, when I was there, they since it was very common, they said the first child's for grandma. So I don't, not sure how that relates, but seems that the grandma's pretty invested in, even though she might be mad at first, that she's still taking on the well-being of the grandchild. Danny.
So I guess, sort of coming back a little bit, you know, we are interested in family structure in themselves, but in a way these family structure differences and transitions are a way to test out the idea of what inputs into children matter most, one could argue. And you sort of set it up with time and money and social capital, perhaps. And so I wonder if these different models give us some, in the end, some insight. I think Ron was getting at this was his original question on time use a little bit. You know, so what matters for kids? And maybe we often, and I guess to push it a little bit, when we think about time and model time in the US, we're often modeling quantity rather than quality of time, and it seems like maybe you have some nuanced findings around that with the grandparents. I wonder if you would step back and sort of reflect on time, money, what about time?
Well, I guess the time aspect, what comes to mind is the education level of the grandparents. So they might be investing the same amount of time, but if that's with a different quality, not because it's more united by emotion, but rather their cognitive level, then the children, I guess, aren't getting as good of an education in some way. So that could be a different twist on the time aspect. And then, of course, the income wealth aspect, we saw differences across family structure. The outcome, social capital, and I don't even talk about that because it feels so nebulous to me. Don't know how to address that in the study.
It's 1:15, so thank you so much.
Thank you.